So welcome to everyone to today's Seattle chapter of the CFO Leadership Council, our presentation on CFO through a global pandemic, how to navigate a minefield. My name is Pamela Franklin, and I'm the Pacific Northwest Chapter Director with the CFO Leadership Council. I'll be working behind the scenes, facilitating today's session, along with the amazing Charisse Gusau, the Marketing Director for the Pacific Northwest. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. Your lines are muted, so there's no distractions. However, we really encourage your questions and comments for today's discussion. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat area, and our moderator, Sterling, will be asking on your behalf to the panel. I'll be monitoring that area too, so we can address all of your concerns. Now, due to the limited time we have together, I might have to ask our speakers to follow up with you after the presentation, especially if your question requires a longer or more thorough answer. But I'm happy to connect you. And actually, after the presentation, you'll have that direct connection to the panelists. If you'd like to receive CPEs for today's webcast, you'll need to answer all 5 of the polling questions asked throughout this afternoon's webinar. These polling questions will appear silently through the presentation. In order to answer the polling questions effectively, you need to be logged into today's session through the unique Zoom link that you were provided upon registration. If you dialed in through your phone and would like to receive CPEs, please hang up and log in through your computer using the direct link provided to you at registration. Now, if you're having any technical issues answering the polling questions that appear on the screen, please feel free to private chat message Charisse, and she'd be happy to log your responses to ensure you get the proper credit. Talking about the chat area, please check the chat area as Charisse has attached handouts for today's event, including a breakdown of attendees and learning objectives for today's event, as well as a membership flyer to allow you to dive deeper into the CFOLC membership details. We also have some handouts from our panelists as well. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our sponsor partners, for it's due to the support of these spectacular people and companies that the CFO Leadership Council is able to provide connections and incredible thought leadership like this afternoon's presentation. Today, we have with us Jen Gerard, the Business Development Director of BDO, Christopher Wall, the Associate of Stoll Reeves, Christopher Welch, Business Development Manager of Stoll Reeves, Galina Propkov, Senior Vice President of Bank of America, Morgan Depot, the Global Commercial Banking Director of Bank of America. And we do have one more slide of sponsors. There we are. Thomas Walthour, the account executive with NetSuite, Ann Strasser, Vice President and Branch Manager of Robert Half, Steve McClendon, the CFO of USI, as well as Cam Schilling, the Assistant Vice President of USI, and last but not least, Corey Reed, our account executive, Workday Adaptive Planning Partner. So thank you so much to our sponsors. Like I said, it's with their support that we're able to bring you this type of thought leadership. And now it's my pleasure to stop talking and to introduce you to our moderator for today's presentation, Sterling Adlaka, the Executive Vice President and CFO of the Northwest Center, and a longtime member of the CFO Leadership Council, currently serving on the Seattle Steering Committee. Sterling, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Pamela. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'll start off just by saying an online forum obviously isn't ideal for captivating an audience. And the COVID topic is sort of overwhelming and all over the place, kind of everywhere these days. But we're going to focus on the CFO perspective uniquely, questions tailored specifically to our own concerns. This is going to be sharp and fast-paced. And we have some great resource in our 2 panelists, and Rebecca Cummings and Seth Shapiro today. So we hope it's informative and new and a little bit different than what you've seen in other COVID panels. As Pamela mentioned, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box if you have questions, and I'll try my best to interject them as need be. And then I'd additionally add that there's an optional session of about 30 minutes at the end of our panel discussion. And if you have questions that we don't get to, feel free to ask them on that optional session and we'll try to address them at that time. So with that, we'll get started. Seth, Rebecca, just if both of you, starting with Seth, if you could just give us a 1-minute background on yourself and tell us also what surprised you most about the return to office in the COVID pandemic. Seth, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I am Seth Shapiro, an Executive Vice President and Risk Strategist for USI. I like to flatter myself by saying I may not look it, but I've got 40 years of experience in risk management and insurance. I know some of you are saying you look every day of it, and that's okay. I have been examining the risk implications of COVID since the very beginning. Our recognition early on was that our clients were going to need factual insights to help them navigate the minefield of COVID-19. And so I've really dedicated myself to digging deeply into that. And as a result of that, I'm in a pretty good position to share what I think is good practical guidance with you today. As respects surprises, I think my biggest surprise was the laissez-faire attitude towards COVID-19 that has been revealed throughout the pandemic by a lot of people who I think should know better. And that's not only politicians, regulators, but just members of the general public. Some of that has been fairly shocking to me.
Thanks, Seth. Rebecca?
Thank you, Sterling. Well, I'm right behind you, Seth. So I'm hopeful that my nearly 30 years of experience in HR will help to provide some perspectives as it relates to your employees and their families, as we all learn how to navigate this new COVID reality. So I am the HR director at Mutual Materials. And for those of you not familiar with us, we're a manufacturer and distributor of masonry and hardscape building materials. So as such, we've been identified as an essential business from the very beginning of the pandemic. Therefore, our challenge initially was to address the safety concerns of workers who were unable to work from home and we needed to keep at the work site. That represents about 80% of our workforce, or roughly about 400 employees. So for us, the biggest surprise, frankly, was just the resiliency and commitment of our employees and leadership faced with all the challenges and the uncertainties. I came into work every day, and for that, I just found it astounding. But also on the other side of that, the balance of our workforce, we had to immediately shift over 100 people to a work from home model, and we did it very quickly. The surprise there was how quickly and efficiently we were able to pivot to that model. As a 120-year-old company, change is not so quickly embraced here, and we did phenomenally well. So a couple of different surprises for us.
Thank you both. So Rebecca, starting with you, bad echo here. If an employee refuses to follow office protocols for health checks, what actions can we take as executive members?
Well, for all of us, from the beginning for us, we wanted to be in front of everyone's concerns and implemented very conservative protocols, and following our supporting messaging to all of our employees about health, safety, including PPE requirements, daily self-screens, social distancing. From the very beginning, we took in all the guidance that seemed to change on an hourly basis. But with all that said, I think because our message was about, concern for them and their families, it's really hard to argue that and defy those, protocols and, set expectations. So we didn't have a lot of defiance there. Where we did, we immediately addressed it. We didn't have to police it. We just had to say, it's either you follow our protocols or you need to go home. There just wasn't any time for that kind of behavior. So we've been really fortunate. We've at this point have implemented self-screening, independent. It's not something that we do when they enter the workplace. We're considering doing temperature checks and things as we go into the fall a little bit further. But at this point, we've not had a lot of pushback. And where we have, we've kind of addressed it right up front and sent them home.
Yeah, good. I think that's true. I think that's a very mitigated, low risk potential. But as people do come back from back to the office, there will be some of those occasions. So it is good to be prepared with how you're going to handle that. And then Seth, over to you. Is there any update on the latest thinking on legal liability around the potential for an employee to contract COVID while they're on the job?
Great question. And I'm actually less concerned about liability with respect to an employee who falls ill with COVID, because in most cases, their sole remedy is going to be workers' compensation, where the benefits are statutory and it's not a claim that would take place in tort. And that would apply to any injury that takes place during the course and scope of employment. Where I'm concerned about legal liability for employers is in areas such as discrimination, retaliation, and harassment claims that might be related to furloughs. I know a number of companies furloughed employees, particularly early on in the pandemic. Reductions in force, requests for leave, and those might be under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was a new act that was passed in the midst of the pandemic, as well as more legacy legislation like the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, and then also retaliation. I worry about disability failure to accommodate claims. You know, someone may argue that they can't do some of the things that Rebecca mentioned as being required to stay safe within the mutual materials environment. And then also failure to protect claims. And again, Rebecca talked about the robust framework that they established at Mutual Materials with respect to protecting their employees. And then USI, as an example, has been very prolific in guiding our clients with respect to how they can minimize the failure to protect exposure. Also, I expect there will be claims alleging failure to protect employee privacy. You know, as organizations, for example, take temperatures of employees coming in, you know, is that protected health information? Also abiding by confidentiality requirements, denial or miscalculation of sick leave is a concern. Wage and hour matters, you know, again, relating to changing hours. When you're working from home, when are you on the clock? When are you off the clock? Warn violations if there's a mass layoff as a result of economic downturn resulting from the pandemic, plant closings or office closings, National Labor Relations Act claims, and again, you know, Rebecca mentioned that are union, so that I'm sure is something that they're quite on top of, and then OSHA whistleblower claims. So those are areas where I'm particularly concerned with respect to the liability implications.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. So we're going to dive into a little later in the panel on some of the issues you mentioned, such as harassment, discrimination, HIPAA protected information. But two that you mentioned just now, wage and hours and calculation of leave. Can you explain a little bit more about what your concerns are and what should we do as CFOs to mitigate that risk?
Well, I mean, as you know, the wage and hour laws are very specific about what is required. And there's, even outside of a pandemic environment, there have been a number of organizations that either by intent or by, you know, simple negligence have fallen afoul of those requirements. It becomes even more difficult when there's not that bright line between when you leave the office door at the end of the day or the plant door. And then at that point, you know, for all intents and purposes, you're no longer on the clock. When you're working at home, it's, you know, you don't have that clear line of demarcation between when you're on the clock and when you're not. You know, obviously, without direct supervision, if someone who's, you know, physically proximate to you, there could be you know, sorts of issues around, you know, whether someone was actually working and should you be recording those hours. You know, we've been working, I think, you know, sort of idiosyncratic hours, you know, where it's not, if someone normally worked a 9-to-5 job with a defined set of breaks, you know, it's almost become, at least in our business, not quite a 24/7 environment, but certainly we're putting in a lot of hours at times of the day that wouldn't normally be working hours. And then there's certainly so many changes in policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, laws, and regulations that have sprung up as a result of COVID. You know, complying with wage and hour law is just another thing. And there's, you know, so much attention that a CFO can pay to compliance. So I'm sort of concerned about, whether it's compliance overload.
Yeah, thank you. Onto a somewhat tangential topic, but in terms of insurance coverages, is there anything that's out there now that might be unique to the pandemic or a pandemic? Are there clauses in certain policies that we should be reviewed? Is there anything that you think maybe warrants more attention that might not have gotten our eye as much pre-COVID?
Yeah, I'll start this by saying that even prior to COVID, there were a few carriers that were offering products specifically to address pandemic-related risks. The fact that those existed was largely ignored by most of the insurance buying public. Perhaps the most high-profile buyer of that sort of coverage was the Wimbledon tennis tournament, which got a lot of press for the fact that they had an event cancellation policy that I believe they recovered about $140 million under. There was a product available from a company called Munich Re that was really focused more on like global life insurers and banks and so on. I believe they only sold 2 policies to non-financial corporate customers, which gives you some idea of the level of demand for that product. So while in general, insurers are leery of offering anything that looks like explicit pandemic coverage, there are a few products like that Munich Re product that are becoming available for the next pandemic, not for anything related to this current COVID-19. However, interestingly, Munich Re, which was one of the early players in this marketplace, has just recently put a moratorium on writing any new business for pandemic-related exposures. Now, all that being said, it's never a bad time to do a thorough review of your insurance program. And I think a lot of folks have found that lacking that review, they've perhaps been surprised to a certain extent by coverages that maybe they're able to access related to COVID-19, and perhaps more commonly, coverages they thought that they had that they don't. We have seen a lot of lawsuits filed by insureds against their insurers. I've been keeping a database of those across the country. We're between 900 and 1,000 cases now related to business interruption, but there are a few other ones like, travel accident related and things like that. And one thing we've learned is just a couple of words in a policy or a slight difference in how an underwriter articulates their intent with respect to coverage can make a meaningful difference in the terms of coverage. Another lesson from COVID is that let's be prepared for the next global event that maybe isn't a pandemic, but that could have catastrophic consequences for an organization, and ask yourself, based on the lessons we've learned from COVID, is your insurance program prepared for that next event?
That's great. Thanks, Seth. I'm going to ask a question I asked our own HR team, and they kind of laughed at me, but Rebecca, why can't we just have the employees sign a COVID waiver when they come to the office?
That's interesting to hear your HR team kind of cringed, because when I heard that question, my HR soul cringed as well. Asking an employee to sign a waiver would absolutely send the wrong message, in my opinion. And a waiver doesn't replace the need to maintain a safe workplace. So your focus should be on doing everything you can to ensure strict compliance with state and local orders, CDC, OSHA, and all agencies. And frankly, I don't think a waiver would protect any employer from an OSHA complaint or an employee attempting to open a workers' comp claim. And it could possibly discourage an employee from even returning to the workplace at all, feeding possibly into their concerns that it just isn't safe. So, no waiver.
Yeah, I got it. And Seth alluded to this in one of his earlier comments, but in terms of the health screening that we're doing kind of at the front door when people walk in, aren't the results of that questionnaire protected, HIPAA protected information? And how do we get around just rules against disclosure if an employee does report an illness or report a negative response to one of those questions?
No, I mean, great question. Absolutely, it is protected, which is why most businesses and employers open to the public or to their employees request that before even entering the building, the individual conducts a self-check, if you will, asking questions, do you have a temperature, do you have a cough, etc. And if you answer yes to any of the questions, please don't enter. I mean, bottom line, we don't really want that written statement, of their self-check, because there is a lot of administration there to ensure the privacy of it. In the event, an employee presents to you COVID-related documentation, it should go directly to HR or some designated management or leadership team. Any information about an employee's illness is confidential, medical record in compliance with HIPAA and the ADA, and should be definitely held in confidence.
And I think to a really good point, which is if there is an employee who's exposed, or in particular, if they fall ill with the virus, as the employer, we're not allowed to notify other employees who that person was, correct?
Not the identity, absolutely, that is correct. If it's confirmed an employee is infected, then we must inform fellow coworkers of their possible exposure to COVID, but maintain the confidentiality of their identity as required by law. The employer should also kind of take it a step further, because you've just possibly shared with them they've been exposed in the workplace. You should follow up with them, let them know that what you do in the workplace, to ensure it's, overall hygiene, safety, and compliance with all the protocols. It's a good opportunity to remind them this is why we have very strict protocols in the workplace, social distancing, wearing facial coverings. And then the employer should also instruct the employees, what do you do next? How do you proceed based on this potential exposure? And what steps should you follow? So give them a little bit of support in this process too.
Yeah, so that hits on the topic of a potentially exposed person and the employees who may have interacted with that employee. But what if you have an employee who's just been exposed and not necessarily ill?
Mm-hmm.
We require that person to stay home without pay, just based on that.
Well, yes. I mean, if you follow all the local directives, the CDC guidelines, it is best to send home any employee, especially if they're not feeling well, even if they're asymptomatic and they have a direct correlation to exposure, and then require them basically to stay home until they're symptom-free for a specified period of time before they return, depending on what their symptoms may be, if they have some, or their exposure. If they are exhibiting COVID symptoms, even in the slightest, we recommend they immediately be tested. And with that documentation of the test and the recommendations by their provider regarding quarantining or waiting until the test results are back, more than likely they're going to be eligible for emergency sick pay through FFCRA. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But in our experience, time for you to be flexible with your PTO accruals, now is the time. And for some of our employees that maybe weren't eligible for PTO or didn't have any available and didn't qualify under FFCRA, we advance them time, because at the end of the day, what you want to avoid is having a sick employee coming into the workplace and exposing others just to avoid financial hardship. So.
Yeah, well, that potential lost wages could be meaningful depending on the person. You have companies with various policies about accruing vacation time or PTO time, and new employees may not have it. So let's explore the other side with Seth. If we as CFOs and HR professionals aren't as sort of forward thinking like Rebecca was on advancing PTO time, and we send an employee home who's maybe just been exposed, do they have some legal recourse back to the company for their lost wages?
As long as there's no negligence on the part of the employer with respect to complying with various employment practices laws, the answer is generally going to be no. I think I would say the other side of the coin to what Rebecca talked about with the benefits that are available through the federal government, through the FFCRA, on the insurance side, we generally think of lost wages in the context of an employee injury. So someone has actually tested positive or actually contracted the virus and they're unable to work as a result of that. And in that case, I think I'm pretty safe in saying that the employee's ability to recover lost wages resulting from a COVID-19 infection or exposure would be limited to what's provided under workers' compensation statutes. Also, just being exposed without a positive test is not likely to trigger coverage for lost wages. And that's true in just about every state where I've examined the presumptive indemnification or presumptive benefit language.
Okay, that's good on the employee. And then back to the business, you mentioned business interruption claims, Seth. Can you lay out sort of the key points to potentially making a business interruption claim related to the pandemic?
Yes, this is a huge issue. As I said, there's between 900 and 1,000 claims that have been filed across the United States. Probably wouldn't surprise you to know that I think the preponderance of those are by restaurants and a large number of other hospitality type industries. Another interesting industry group, especially in Washington, that's been filing a lot of claims is dentists' offices. Don't know why, but that's just the case. So to the question, an insured that's trying to recover losses for business interruption under their insurance policy is definitely facing an uphill battle. The primary issue is that under just about every policy in the market, business income coverage is triggered by covered direct physical damage to covered property. So as you would imagine, the trigger here is, or the question is, does COVID-19 constitute direct physical damage? And for the most part, I think the answer to that has been no. The insurers and courts have consistently ruled that the presence of a biological material, and this is obviously predates COVID-19, on covered property does not constitute direct physical loss or damage. And now there are exceptions. For example, there are 2 ongoing cases in Missouri where the courts denied the insurer's motions to dismiss based on the no direct physical loss or damage to covered property argument. And their reasoning was based on a number of items. First was the policies did not define direct physical loss. And in the absence of such explicit definition, the court has to rely on what they called the plain and ordinary meaning of the phrase. The plaintiffs alleged that COVID-19 is a physical substance and that it lives on and is active and inert on inert physical surfaces, and it is also emitted in the air. So this was a big part of their argument. COVID-19 allegedly attached to and denied plaintiffs access to their property, making it, quote, unsafe and unusable, resulting in direct physical loss to the premises and property. Based on those allegations and an amended complaint, they alleged that there was direct physical loss based on the plain and ordinary meaning of the phrase, which was the standard that the court has established based on the initial filing. The policies also cover accidental physical loss or accidental physical damage. In the Missouri cases, the court said that the defendant, insurers, were conflating the word loss and the word damage in its argument, and that the policies require tangible physical alteration. However, they didn't give meaning to those terms. And there was a prior case, which actually happened to be a Washington case called Nautilus Group v. Allianz, where they said in that case, quote, if physical loss was interpreted to mean damage, then one or the other would be superfluous. And since the policies in question in these Missouri cases use both the words loss and damage, one of them is clearly superfluous. And the question is which one? And then finally, the court defended or rejected the insurance company's argument that if they accepted the plaintiff's interpretation, that physical loss would be found wherever a business suffers economic harm. Here, the court said that the plaintiff's harm is tied to their alleged physical loss caused by COVID-19 and the closure orders. So the closure orders are a very important aspect of this because they allege that the pandemic and closure orders required the plaintiffs to cease and or significantly reduce operations and prohibit and continue to prohibit access to the premises. So again, it's early days with these cases, but a dismissal of a or denial of a motion to dismiss on the part of the carrier, we see that as a plus for the insured policyholder community. So I wouldn't take this ruling or this judgment by these Missouri courts to the bank, but it does provide some food for thought. And there is one particular carrier who I won't mention by name, but if anybody wants to know, just contact me separately, where there is language in their policy that does seem to open the door at least slightly, make it ajar with respect to coverage for business income for COVID-19. Unfortunately, it's a carrier that doesn't write a lot of business in Washington State.
Got it. So if we happen to be in an industry in a state where our governor just doesn't like our industry and uses the pandemic as an excuse, how about the closure coverage ruling in the Missouri case? Is that any help when we're targeted politically?
Well, it's a good question. And again, just based on what I've seen, and I've gotten to the point now where I almost remember every plaintiff's name on this list of 950 policyholder suits. So I've been deep into this. I'm not optimistic that there's going to be any kind of meaningful coverage, other than perhaps with the exception of this one carrier that I mentioned that does write a lot of business in the Midwest for smaller insureds, where through perhaps lack of oversight or just lack of anticipation of something like the COVID-19 pandemic, they had language in there that could be interpreted in such a way as to result in a grant of coverage. It's with limited exceptions, it's hard to find insurance for the politically motivated actions of elected officials. And really that's, I think, what you're referring to. I mentioned in the Missouri case, one of the requirements was that the damage be accidental, and I think what you're describing is something that was done with intent. Now, I'm not going so far as to say that there was necessarily targeting of certain industries, because I'd like to think that we're above that. But I know that it does seem like there's a disproportionate impact on certain industries, which is certainly unfortunate. And certainly a number of our clients have been impacted by that. But trying to find insurance for what we call political risk, particularly within the United States, is kind of a fool's errand. It's just about impossible.
Any other things we should consider, event cancellation or anything else?
Event cancellation, as I mentioned earlier, Wimbledon did recover under their policy. Now, granted, they have been paying premiums since 2003. What triggered them buying that program originally was the SARS outbreak. Unfortunately, they were one of the few organizations that, I don't want to say that learned the lesson, because I think a lot of companies learned the lesson. But if you look at the cost that they paid for that coverage, they paid about £1.5 million a year for 17 years. In order to recover $140 million. Now, one would argue that that's a pretty good deal, right? But probably wouldn't have made economic sense for everybody. Now, I do imagine that what you'll see, if there is a continuing market for pandemic-related coverage, and it does seem like it is coming back to an extent. I mentioned the Munich Re decision to put a moratorium on new placements, but there are a few other carriers that are offering coverage even today. You could go out and buy it for the next pandemic. It's not going to be cheap. It's probably going to have high retentions or deductibles. There's going to be limited capacity, but it is available. The question is, are companies going to react like they did after SARS and say, oh, this happened and we're just going to continue doing things the way we always have? Will they react like Wimbledon and say, oh, this is a wake-up call, there's something we need to do? Or somewhere in between, and my guess is it's somewhere in between. An important thing to remember is coverage for insurable exposures, keyword is insurable, is nearly always available for a price. The question is, after COVID-19, is the price for pandemic-related coverage is going to be so high that it essentially becomes impractical for anybody to buy it.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent point. Well taken. So we covered that off pretty well, I think. So thank you. Let's turn back to things that are more directly in our control at the operational employee level. Maybe Rebecca, back to you. After the stay-at-home orders are lifted, how do we address employees who may be at high risk?
Well, first of all, we should not assume someone is considered high risk. It would be seen as discriminatory in nature if you were to approach an employee and ask that question. However, if the employee states they cannot return due to their high risk classification, then it should be managed as you would any other request for accommodation under ADA, and just request documentation from their provider.
What if an employee, sure some of my peers here can relate to this, but what if an employee claims, for instance, they live with someone else who's high risk, and we just don't believe them? We don't believe them as their boss. We think it's just an excuse. What recommendations do you have in that situation?
Well, suspicions aside, it's just always best practice to require documentation from any employee requesting that they be allowed to continue to work from home for whatever reason. Medical professionals understand employers need this documentation to verify these requests of accommodation from employees. We have not had any resistance from employees or their providers in receiving the necessary documentation. So, you know, if it is the circumstance for that employee, then I would imagine they would be easily, you know, readily available to get that documentation. We have had the circumstance where this was the exact scenario, and they weren't able to give us the documentation, and they moved along. So I think for those that are in the circumstances, they'll be compliant.
And Seth, with Rebecca's answer there, which sounds very reasonable, very logical, sort of very appropriate thing to do. Do you see pitfalls even with her response with potential release of HIPAA protected information?
Good. Again, great question. And this is an area where the EEOC came out fairly early on and indicated that for ordinary medical questionnaires, like the temperature testing and the questions about, you know, general feeling of well-being, while they would be impermissible under the ADA, they are allowed in the COVID-19 context. So that's a pretty significant change. The idea being that by doing that, we're protecting the health and safety of our employees. So very logical, very well-founded decision. As a result of that, a lot of employees have implemented symptom monitoring protocols for employees. We have done it. Mutual Materials has clearly done it. Some of it is self-monitoring, like we have an online tool that some of our employees are able to use if they're planning on coming to the office. Also reporting to employer-imposed temperature checks. And while that information gathering is allowed, employers shouldn't assume that they can forego adequate controls. It still should be treated as confidential medical information. And that means that employers should treat and store it just like they do all other employee medical information that they receive, which means in files ideally separate from employee personnel files, using segmentation and, you know, in many cases, ideally using encryption, with limited access, not only by other employees, but by potentially third-party bad actors.
What risks, Seth, do you see on the potential age discrimination side if it's not a health issue, but more an age?
Right. And again, this kind of gets back to what Rebecca was saying about, you know, making assumptions. The EEOC, again, was proactive here, and they said that employers may not make assumptions about their employees' ages or ability to telework or their known or perceived disabilities or suspected vulnerabilities when making decisions with respect to the employee's ability to work from home. And even when you make a decision, when you're trying to be a good Samaritan, when you're trying to, you know, do something benevolent towards your employee, that can still be deemed discriminatory in retrospect if they're based on what have been called paternalistic assumptions. So employers should avoid blanket exclusions for employees that are perceived as being vulnerable when they're creating and implementing return to work policies. And then also employees adversely affected by reduction in force decisions can allege the decision was a pretext to eliminate them because you couldn't do it otherwise because of some protected characteristic, such as age. In other words, they might claim that the employer used the furlough or layoff process as an excuse to get rid of employees in certain protected categories based on age, race, national origin, gender, or some other protected characteristic. So employers that are making layoffs or phased return to work decisions need to take very close care to auditing their list of affected employees to determine if certain groups have been adversely impacted. And as we've learned in different contexts from, for example, some of the hiring practices at one of the large global tech companies, it's sometimes inadvertent. You know, they happen to be using artificial intelligence and, you know, simply as a function of unanticipated outcomes, they happen to discriminate against women. The same thing can happen in this context. And it's just important to be very much aware of those potential unintended consequences.
Yeah, Rebecca, on that note of being paternalistic, of course, we can still require employees to wear masks. I mean, that's sort of commonplace now.
Absolutely. I mean, with some exceptions, employers have always been able to institute policies as they see fit, including safety protocols. And as most states follow the at-will employment, doctrine, employees can be terminated for refusing to comply with an employer's policies, if those policies are not themselves illegal or hazardous, of course. And since the CDC's formally recommended mask use and most states have mandated their use, employees not wanting to wear a mask have few good reasons to refuse. So an employee could decline to wear a face mask if a legitimate medical condition prevents them from safely doing so. And in that case, the employee could ask for an accommodation and the employer would determine if a reasonable accommodation can be provided. We've certainly faced this in our environment, both in our office and in our manufacturing. And I would say in nearly all of the requests to review and consider accommodation, we've been able to come to an excellent solution, isolating them in an office and or providing alternative face shields. So, it's there's not just one mask, one style fits all. You've got to look at the accommodations that you can possibly make.
So the safety protocols you mentioned, would that extend to asking employees to get a COVID vaccine once it's available?
Wow. So, honestly, I'm sure like many of you, we're looking into this right now, but for Mutual, as a manufacturer and distributor of masonry products, I don't feel we would qualify as a high-risk profession to require employees to be vaccinated. However, we will be educating our employees on the benefits of preventative vaccinations, such as the flu vaccine and, when available, the COVID vaccine. We will also do whatever we possibly can to make it as convenient as possible for our employees by bringing in providers on site to provide the vaccines. We're doing just that for the flu vaccine this next month. And, we hope that sets the stage in education, but in also supporting our employees.
So you're saying there may be some behavioral changes we can make it easy for employees, do all those things without requiring it, and not stepping on that potential landmine.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We've talked a little bit about the FFCRA. I think both of you have mentioned it a couple of times, the Families First Coronavirus Act. Rebecca, can you just lay out, maybe just quickly summarize the key points from that act?
Sure. So for all of us, the act took effect April 1st, affecting employers of 500 or less, and essentially providing three major provisions for the employer. So it requires employers to provide paid leave through two separate provisions: the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, which entitles workers up to 80 hours of paid sick time when they're unable to work for certain reasons related to COVID-19, and two, Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act, which essentially is expanded FMLA, which entitles workers to certain paid family and medical leave. So also the third component there for employers that were subject to paying the emergency sick pay or the expanded FMLA paid leave, they are now entitled to fully refundable tax credits to cover the costs that they extended to the employees.
Thanks, Rebecca. Seth, if we have an employee who just refuses to return to the office, and I've had this at Northwest Center, but and they end up being terminated. I think Rebecca alluded to this might have happened at Mutual Materials as well. We end up terminating them ostensibly for that reason. What legal risks might we be incurring at the company?
Yes, this is a very complex question because there are a number of different federal laws that could potentially be implicated. From an OSHA perspective, and OSHA's mandate is occupational safety and health. Employees can claim that working in an environment where COVID is a potential hazard is so dangerous that they have a right to refuse work. The act that led to the formation of OSHA protects employees from retaliation in particular circumstances when they refuse to work, but there's got to be quote unquote imminent danger in the situation. What is not clear is whether COVID-19 rises to the level of an imminent danger. No one can guarantee the health of the public, much less their employees, in the middle of a global pandemic, and that's just a reality. No court or administrative panel as of yet has ruled that COVID-19 is an imminent danger. However, in another context, there was a federal judge who declined to grant an injunction to pork plant workers who asserted their plant was inadequately protecting the workforce from COVID-19. The apprehension about contracting COVID-19 was not an actual harm. And even if COVID-19 is deemed an imminent danger, it is clear that employers don't have to pay employees if they refuse to work. So that's the OSHA perspective. From a National Labor Relations Act perspective, whether an employee has a protected right to refuse to work or refuse to return to work because of safety concerns related to COVID will depend on whether their conduct constitutes protected concerted activity under the Enabling Act, the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Board has recognized an employee engages in protected concerted activity when they take an action, quote, with or on behalf of other employees, unquote, concerning the terms and conditions of their employment. This typically involves group activity. Obviously, a group is 2 or more employees. A single employee seeking to incite group action, or an individual employee bringing group complaints to the attention of management. By contrast, actions an individual takes without the actual support of the other employees, or actions that relate only to the individual's personal interests, are generally not concerted and thus not protected. So group potentially protected, individual not protected under the National Labor Relations Act. And then in addition, even a concerted employee action may not be protected when they relate to an issue over which the employer lacks control. And it's conceivable that something like a global pandemic could be ruled to be outside the employer's control. So the bottom line is that employers need to understand that unionized employees potentially may refuse to work due to their fear of becoming infected, even if the applicable collective bargaining agreement contains a no strike provision. And then further discussion of these issues, because they are very complicated as respects to National Labor Relations Act, should be undertaken with your counsel.
Yeah, I want to ask Seth, we're all having these COVID panels and getting a lot of guidelines about workplace signage and distancing policies and issuing guidelines. I get all that, but if the guidelines are deemed to be insufficient, let's say an employee falls ill and rightfully claims the guidelines were insufficient, I'm wondering if having those might actually put us at more risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no. So I think, anyone who expects that there won't be employee lawsuits is being hopelessly optimistic. However, employers are likely to have statutory defenses that mitigate their risk. And we talked about some of those that have already arisen in the context of OSHA, EEOC, and LRB. So there are some things employers should be aware of and that are highly relevant here. And that are exceptions for intentional torts or fraudulent concealment and lack of coverage for third-party suits. So if you do something intentionally that's going to harm your employees, or if you conceal some dangerous condition, and Rebecca kind of hinted at this earlier when she was talking about the ill-considered use of waivers, then you're not going to expect to have coverage under your insurance policies because intentional acts are generally not covered. However, if you take affirmative steps to protect your employees, that is a very good mechanism for reducing your potential liability. In tort cases, the best factual defense for any potential employee suit is appropriate procedures that reduce the risk of injury. And there's plenty of guidance from OSHA, from CDC, from state and local officials, and in fact, the state of Washington just recently, I think in the last couple of days, put out new guidance for reopening. Following those guidelines, I believe would go a long way toward satisfying the prudent man doctrine that is often brought into play in these negligence suits. They evidence that the employer satisfied duty of reasonable care, and they also may discourage lawsuits. If someone knows that they would have a tough road to hoe to prove negligence, I don't know that there are a lot of attorneys that would be willing to take that kind of case, particularly not take it on contingency. And then, there's a economic reality that failure to address COVID-19 related risks can subject employers to scrutiny by regulators, and it's in their economic best interest to do what's best for them, which as a function of that also results in doing what's best for their employees.
Yeah, thanks. Rebecca, Seth, just conscientious of time, we're virtually running out here. I'm going to jump around just a little bit and see if we can knock out some hot topics with the last couple minutes that we have. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. Seth, on D&O coverage specifically, if you're a public company, say you're working for an electric vehicle maker with a CEO who has a raging tweet habit, can you discuss some of the risks there? The D&O policy, is it worthwhile to review it from a private company? And then is Side A coverage something you can sort of quickly explain and tell us if that's something we should be looking at?
Right. Yes, yes, and yes. So we're seeing we've seen over the last probably 20 years an evolution in D&O claims. They used to be primarily based on financial accounting matters. Now we are seeing a lot more what are being called incident-based or incident-driven claims, where some perceived bad outcome resulted from global pandemic, from a cybersecurity event, from bad outcome in a drug trial, a formal investigation by the SEC. Those have been leading to D&O claims. So it's very important to recognize that COVID and D&O could very easily be implicated. I think what you're going to see going forward is some D&O carriers are going to explicitly exclude pandemic-related claims. Yet to be seen, but I think that not unlikely that that's going to happen. A couple of important points would be to make sure that if you think you've got something, a circumstance that is likely to give rise to a claim or actually a claim, make sure you send that in to your carrier. Don't run the risk of having something denied because of late notice. And then if you can, try to get the claim into the current policy period before carriers start more broadly excluding pandemic in their D&O policies. Because if you wait till later, you may not actually have coverage for that particular circumstance. As far as Side A coverage, I mean, obviously Side A is absolutely critical if you're going to have qualified board members, because it protects them and they don't have to reach into their own pocket in the event that the company is unable to indemnify them. So given that it's the insurance of last resort, again, you just want to pay attention to the nature of the coverage that you're being provided. Look at the timing of when you want to provide notice of circumstance or claim. You may find that because of the fallout from COVID-19, which is clearly a systemic event, that Side A insurance may not quite be so generous. It's generally been a very broad form, and I think you may see it narrowing. And you also may see, because of bankruptcies resulting from COVID-19 or serious cash flow problems, Side A D&O policies may be tapped more frequently because companies are not in a position to fulfill their indemnification obligations. And of course, D&O underwriters are very, very concerned about that. I will say that the direct incurred loss ratio in the first half of 2020 for D&O was the highest it's been in 10 years. I believe to a large extent that's tied to COVID-19.
Thank you, Seth. And Rebecca, I want to start to close out here. Again, conscientious of time. So I'm going to throw you a little bit of a doozy of a question, but you've got quite a bit of experience with employees traveling overseas. And we have a lot of international company CFOs on the call today. And also for those of us dealing with union-based workforces on CBA agreements and such, between traveling overseas, international operations, and union workforce, what are some of the key suggestions you have for our audience today on those fronts?
For us, as well as, some of, the individuals that I speak to frequently, I mean, companies are just appropriately being cautious right now. Things are changing day by day. There's obviously recommendations that we avoid non-essential travel, especially to high-risk destinations. But even those destinations that aren't deemed today high risk, can quickly, as I think I looked at reports today, just the numbers in different countries as well as different states here, just spiking. So it's recommended just to limit to essential travel only and moderate at that. Also, the travel restrictions and mandatory quarantines. So even if you have, your employee that is going to another country or even to another state, sometimes returning from that area, you're subject to quarantines, and that can be very disruptive to your business operations. So, bottom line, employers don't need this on top of everything else and should likely defer, non-essential travel for the time being.
And what about on union-based workforce? Any tips for us there?
Oh, just communication. We have 4 unions that we work with, and, I felt like if I just contacted them, on a weekly basis, they would get tired of me. And it seemed to work. So except for one came back and they wanted hazard pay and they wanted to negotiate that. It's like, no, we're doing everything right. What you're suggesting is, I'm putting these people on the front line, and that's not the case. So, stand by your protocols, stand by your policies, be diligent about it, and stand your ground, because, if you're doing everything right, then you're in a good place.
Thanks, Rebecca. As we look to wrap up the panel portion of the session here, if I could ask you both, maybe starting with you, Seth, and then directly to you, Rebecca, if there's one thing you would highlight that we should be remembering and taking away from this panel, and it was just one thing, what would that be?
Well, I kind of break it down into sort of watchwords, things that should, words that should characterize your actions.
Seth, I knew you couldn't answer just one thing. I knew.
Okay. So I would say be prudent, be thoughtful, be diligent, don't take things for granted, pay attention to the details, focus on compliance. Very, very important, because, the world will continue to revolve even with COVID-19. And there are other areas where lack of compliance might have really significant unintended and negative consequences for you. And then, apply common sense. don't act precipitously. My shorthand for that is measure twice, cut once. And I think if you follow those guidelines, you will be positioned to make, I guess I'd call it, the best of a very challenging and very difficult situation.
Thank you both. I thought that was both, you were both super helpful and informative. And we've got our 30-minute optional session starting here shortly. Before I turn it back over to Pamela, I thought I'd just give you a quick rundown of what happened at Northwest Center as one of your peers who's been dealing with a lot of these issues in real time. Northwest Center is a 501c3 with a mission to assist children and adults with disabilities through early childhood development therapy and through career services. Unique to us, we fund the charitable causes of the organization almost exclusively with cash flow from business operations. So through the pandemic, we've operated 5 commercial businesses, all of them to be deemed essential, including the ubiquitous to Seattle Big Blue Truck, many of you know, as well as operations in janitorial services, commercial laundry, staffing business covering almost all of Amazon's clerical workforce that are actually our employees, operating 2 preschools which reopened for in-class instruction all the way back in May. So their students have been in class since early May. A few of our biggest highlights that I think are pertinent to the CFO in the pandemic, one that applies to kind of one on the call, all of our businesses had to adopt in the pandemic. But it's important to know that doesn't actually stop once you're back in the office. The rules and guidelines are still changing regularly. You heard both Rebecca and comment on laws that are in place, or in play, I should say, still working their way through Congress, a number of legal cases that have still yet to be resolved. The rules are changing constantly. The virus itself is evolving. Your organization culturally for a near state of constant change. And how do you do that is sort of easier said than done. A couple things we've had success with is accepting semi-permanence of flexible work hours. When most companies are back in the office, schools won't necessarily be, daycares won't necessarily be. Health concerns, as you heard, may limit some people's ability to come back. Just be ready to continue to leverage technology and address all those differences. Another tip would be, if you don't already, just read voraciously about businesses and policy in other countries. And in some cases that can provide a window into what's likely to happen next in the US. When you do get back in the office, I have a couple almost random tips here, but those infrared temperature guns, they're just always really low. I always read just below 97, almost every day, 97 degrees. And you're supposed to be at 98.6. So I recommend setting that mark well below 100 degrees where a fever is triggered. We set ours at 99 degrees. We talked a lot about potential discrimination and HIPAA information protection. One thing that's been a helpful tip for us, for those who can't wear a mask for health reasons, it's fair to go back and ask if they're able to wear a face shield instead. Some experts actually think the protection offered by a shield may be even better than a mask anyhow, because it covers the eyes. And it's fair to ask. They may not be able to wear a mask or a shield either, but it's fair to ask that question. And partly because of the uncertainty and the nerves with coming back to the office in this environment, it's more important than ever to solicit employee feedback, listen to it, learn from it. A lot of our good ideas have come from employees themselves. You know, we're usually not on the front lines. We're sitting behind a computer on Excel spreadsheets. It's good to solicit that feedback. And take it to heart and really listen to it and really try and craft policy based on the feedback you get. People are usually on edge for the first 2 weeks. And one thing we'd recommend about sort of easing some of those nerves is don't split hairs on protective equipment. If people want to wear a full body hazmat suit to the office, just let them. And I'd offer to pay for half of it. You know, keep PPE supplies on hand within reason. And then over time, what we found over a couple weeks or so, that anxiety tends to wear off. But it really curries a lot of favor. It makes people comfortable to have that PPE on hand. You've heard us all say and talk about the risks associated with guidelines, but draft as many procedures as you can. We would spell out how employees should enter the building, but also have lunch, exposure notifications, know that in advance before anyone gets sick. write a procedure for everything, and then you can run that through your HR team, through your insurance brokers, through other advisors. Along those same lines, know in advance how you're going to handle the work site once a person does test positive. It's frankly, with a workforce of any size over a few hundred, it's almost an inevitability. You're going to have someone contract the virus, let alone be exposed in some way. And you just want the procedure laid out, documented, and ready to execute. You don't want to be debating that once it happens. And the last thing I'd mention, and we'll close up here with this note, but sanitation protocols are huge. We haven't talked about that much today. Identify volunteers to wipe down public spaces at regular intervals. Some of us, like me, I'm a germaphobe. I'm obviously on the exec team, and I'm happy to volunteer to wipe down the kitchen counters because, you know, that stuff freaks me out. So you'll find a ready volunteer base to do that sort of thing. There are two popular services that we offer at Northwest Center that I think everyone should consider. One is hospital grade sanitation and disinfection services. We provide this for both small and large companies. When you know your office is hospital grade clean, it's incredibly comforting. It feels safer in the office than it does going to the grocery store. Pamela's going to send out a flyer after the panel, and there's contact info in that flyer if you'd like to get hospital grade clean office space. The second one's a kind of unique idea, but we work with a large cadre of adults with disabilities that work in our classrooms as assistants. Many of them work part-time, or they only work part of the week. Their schedules can be flexible. Several of our customers are hiring them at an attractive hourly rate to take on clerical tasks as well as spot cleaning duties. So add that to their list of responsibilities so that cleaning happens in your office nonstop. It may be just as much about emotional comfort as it is sort of physical disinfection, but it's been a huge help for our school classrooms in particular. It's an incredibly comforting service, something that would improve the workplace climate with or without the pandemic. So give us a call if any of that's an interest. We have workers ready to go. And that concludes our panel session. I'll turn it now back over to Pamela for concluding remarks and to introduce the optional session topics.
Well, Sterling, thank you. And Seth, thank you. And I have a question. I'm not sure if I was able to hear what Rebecca's one highlight was. So Rebecca, I'd love to hear, what is your one takeaway or one highlight that you'd like to share from the panel?
You know, I think what really resonated with me, and it's something that is the biggest challenge that we're facing right now with the work from home as well as the returning to the workplace, is managing the wage and hour issue. If it's something that you haven't started to consider, or or possibly maybe you're not concerned about it, but I would start looking at that a little bit more, because I think that's for the frontline managers, that's going to be their biggest challenge in monitoring productivity from work from home and then transitioning people back to the workplace.
Fantastic. Absolutely, Rebecca. Thank you so much for that highlight. Thanks for contributing to our panel. Seth, thank you for contributing to our panel. Sterling, you did a phenomenal job moderating and coordinating all this incredible information. I just want to encourage any of you to reach out directly to Sterling, Rebecca, or Seth. We have about 9 more minutes. And so once I conclude, we can just go ahead and open up our cameras and come off mute and talk directly to our panelists. But just a couple of things we wanted to make sure that you all know. We want to keep our friends and members connected through the season and beyond. So if you're wondering on how to become a member, please connect with me after this webcast. We have 2 levels of involvement. Membership starts the day you join and includes a variety of benefits, including access to our upcoming CFO Leadership Conference in November. And just to kind of slide on into that, we're thrilled to announce that we're doing it again. We are combining forces with MIT's Management Executive Education Program to offer our CFO Masterclass keynote series on leadership from some of the world's best CFOs from Goldman Sachs, Peloton, Microsoft, 23andMe, and so much more. Actually, on the second day, we're going to have a real fun business of sports discussion, including experts from ESPN, the the LPGA, San Diego Padres, the NBA, and more. We also have limited space, but space on the MIT Accelerator program, which is one-on-one education with MIT execs during that period of time. So all of that information can be found on our website. Finally, just like with any of our events, after the event, we're going to send you a brief survey, and we're just looking for your feedback. We hope you can take the time to complete it, because your input helps us continually search for ways to bring more value to the CFO Leadership Council community.